Aš kalbėsiu angliškai iš karto, sakau, todėl kad tokia sutartinė mūsų susitikimo kalba. So hello everyone here live in Vilnius University Theatre Hall and watching us on your any platform you'd like. I will shortly introduce the idea behind this discussion that was held 2 weeks ago with Professor Krzysztof Dikman. Vilnius University, and especially the rector of Vilnius University, Rimvydas Petrauskas, in his program emphasized the value of leadership of university in the country, in its culture, in its public debates. And as we see in our region, and there's no coincidence that we're talking today about Poland, so as Poland has many examples, I think, of nowadays tendency of politicizing history and historical questions, and some kind of push towards academical society to talk what is supposed to be the right thing for the nation or the right thing for the country. I think the same we could say about all Eastern Europe. We see the tendency of rising xenophobia, of rising anti-Semitism, or at least of whistle blowing towards that, or just trying to somehow change the narrative and change or newly interpret historical facts. So in that sense, university and academic society must be the space to tell the truth without wondering or without being scared that you will have some kind of repercussions, or you will be, I don't know, pushed aside, ostracized, or something like that in society. And I think it's a good opportunity to rethink those historical truths and narratives in nowadays context, and think why they are still valuable and why we still can learn something from them. And in the sense that I said, in the region sense, we also must ensure that historical truths will not be the political, the battleground of political parties and the battleground of political views that tries to grab them and encompass them. So to summarize my short speech, I just want to thank Shtetl organization for providing intellectual material for our discussions. And I hope that this really good relationship and this good cooperation between Shtetl and Vilnius University will be the start of the discussions. What's happening and what's happening with new interpretations of history and why it is important to tell the historical truth. And with no further ado, I would like to bring the microphone to Professor Dariusz Stola. Maybe Sergey, you would like to say something to present the professor and his credentials. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulius. As Paulius said, it's a joint event between Vilnius University and Shtetl Jewish Memorial Fund Museum of Shtetl. The speaker today is Professor of History, Dariusz Stola, an author of over hundreds of articles on the top and 6 books over the topic, different topics of political migration, Jewish-Polish relationships, the memory of the past, and his last work was with very famous Polin Museum between 2014 and 2019. Dariusz Stola was a director of this institution, and as you probably may know, after long and unsuccessful battle with political establishment, he was forced to leave the position. of that very, very successful institution he was managing pretty much successfully. I'd like to say a few words about rather symbolic fact that we are, during pandemic, as an actor, probably, or actors, as professors, like Professor Darius Stola, we all prefer the full audience. We all know the circumstances, we all know the situation. The lecture will be on YouTube. I thank those who made an effort and came over to listen and to ask questions to Professor Stola. And I hope that you know, this emptiness will not echo for the topics we are going to raise, because very often we intellectuals, academics, historians, we gather, we speak, we understand each other, and then when we hope for understanding from the political establishment, very often we find ourselves very much alone. So I give a stage to Professor Darius Stola. Thank him for coming and thank you for listening. We'll take questions after Darius Stola will conclude his lecture. Thank you.
First, I wish to thank very much Sergey and the Foundation for the invitation to Vilnius. It's my great pleasure to come here. Actually, it's been my first flight for 2 years. My first academic visit abroad since the pandemic started, so I'm really happy I can do it here. I'm grateful to the university to allow me to speak in this fantastic historical entourage. Really beautiful. I have just met with the rector of the university, a great honor for me, and I realized that he has the best view probably any university in continental Europe one may have on this fantastic Baroque architecture of the university. I would like to speak today about a crossroads of a history of a single institution, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, the Polin Museum, and a much broader history, much broader question, that is how we deal with the past. What academics, politicians, media, and the general public do with the past, and why they are still interested. And clearly, not all the past is past. There are some fragments of the past that are very much present, that are very much alive. And in Poland, and not only in Poland, the Polish Jewish past is not past. Some of its fragments repeatedly come again and again in public debates. And I will come back to it in a second, because we have probably 16 or more major public debates on Polish Jewish past, mostly on the Holocaust, but not exclusively. So there are some pasts that don't want to go away. And I would say they should not go away. They are too precious. Even when they are tensions, when they are dramatic, when they are difficult, they offer a chance to better understand the present and to reflect upon ourselves, and upon not only ourselves, upon the major questions of humanity, of European culture. I don't want to reduce it to our parochial East European perspectives. I think because of the dramatic 20th century history, we have a painful privilege to have better access to knowledge which may be useful to other people. When I speak to my colleagues in North America or in Israel or in Western Europe, I think this is something we can convey. And when I say we, I mean not only the Poles, but basically East Europeans who have had the experience of the 20th century, and especially the Second World War and the communist regime, quite different from the Europeans from Western and Southern Europe. So let me begin with the story of the Polin Museum and show first why we have this museum. And here in Vilnius, I don't need to explain it. Warsaw is a big Jewish metropolis. 30% of the population of the city of Warsaw before the Second World War was Jewish. At a moment in the early 20th century, still under Russian rule, Jews made 40% of the city population. And we know that in smaller towns across Eastern Europe, Jews were a majority of the town. In interwar Poland, Jews made a third of the urban population in general. So why they made about 10% of the population, total population, they made a significant part of the urban population. And cities were not only the drivers of economic change, like industry, but also the drivers of cultural change that was deeply transforming all of Poland and all of the European continent. The picture which you see here comes from Muranów, the northwestern part of Warsaw, which was between 80 and 90% Jewish, which means that was a Jewish world with Christian minorities scattered. There were some Christians living in Catholic or Orthodox, but in general that was the difference to West European cities where Jews were scattered among the non-Jews. And this is something quite typical to many urban locations. So with almost 200 synagogues and the houses of prayers, innumerable political parties and newspapers and businesses and theaters and cinemas, this was clearly the cultural center, the Jewish cultural center of Eastern Europe. And we know what happened later on. This is the same place in 1945 when German army left the city. The ghetto area, Warsaw Ghetto, was the biggest one. Its population was mostly killed in the summer of 1942, deported to the death camp of Treblinka. But then the systematic destruction started during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in spring 1943, and afterwards, and it was systematic. At the end of the occupation, the Germans shipped to Germany millions of bricks. Bricks, steel, anything that you could extract from the ruins of this destroyed city. And then came the decades of the communist rule, and I'm showing how the landscape was changing. You can see on the upper left corner, you can see the monuments to the heroes and martyrs of the Warsaw Ghetto, which was erected in 1948 for the 5th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Standing among the ruins, there was nothing left. There was a street cleared only, and this monument erected. Actually, it was not the first monument to the Warsaw Ghetto. The first one was erected immediately, almost immediately, in 1946, a smaller one, and exists to the present, which shows there was a strong effort for commemoration. Then you can see on the bigger picture how gradually the city, the life was coming back to this part of Warsaw. It was not Jewish life, but it was a life. You can see typical housing blocks from late 1950s, early 1960s, modernist architecture, which you can find from Vladivostok to East Berlin, with some local features, but basically a nondescript architecture. And the monument, and then you can see it in the early 2000s, now in democratic Poland, and you can see by the number of trees how much time have passed. 2 generations. A lot has changed. And in this time, first, only 10% of Polish Jews survived the war. Out of almost 3.5 million Polish Jews, only some 300, maybe a little more than 300 survived the war, most of them in the Soviet Union. Those who were lucky to be deported to Kazakhstan or escape in the summer of 1941, very few Jews survived in occupied Poland and hiding. And out of these some 300,000 Jews, again, almost all of them left. Some of them left immediately after the war, especially after the Kielce pogrom of summer of 1946. And then we had the 3 waves of emigration, 1949, 1956, and the final one, 1968, after which just several thousand Jews remained. The Jewish life was almost, the organized Jewish life was almost practically destroyed. There were no rabbis, no organized religious life. There was a token Jewish Cultural Association, but pretty much not much remained. And this is important for various reasons. First, it led to a decline of the Holocaust research in Poland and research on Jewish history in Poland, because most of Jewish historians have emigrated. There was a little kind of a research ghetto in the Jewish Historical Institute where still this research was allowed. But ordinary Poles didn't have Jewish neighbors with whom who could share the history from a Jewish perspective. And that was important in shaping the images of war that Christian Poles had, that non-Jewish Poles had. And this led to a quite of a late, but not unusual for Eastern Europe. Actually, I must say that in Poland, even this monument, which you can see here, contrary to the monuments erected in the Soviet Union, it was very clear that this is about Jewish history. There are menorahs, there is inscriptions in Hebrew letters, it's clear. There was no hiding, you know, like peaceful citizens of the Soviet Union, as it was at many Soviet monuments of the victims of the Holocaust in the Soviet territory. So Poland was different, but still Jewish history was marginalized. And sometime in the 1980s started the process of re-earthing or a revival of the memory of Jewish history in Poland. The milestones of this process that were visible, because it was a process that happening at many levels, the academic level, cultural level. For example, we have a rapid increase of books, really top quality literature on Polish Jewish history, written in Polish by authors of Jewish origin or not Jewish origin, and we see it already in the mid-1980s. And then we see, again, Poland was rather unique, a relative liberalization in the last years of the communist regime in Poland, when General Jaruzelski really wanted to improve the image of Poland. He was opening door for academic contacts. It allowed my older colleagues, my professors, to go abroad for conferences. That was the beginning of the revival of Jewish studies in Poland. And then we had a series of debates, big public debates, which I would like to mention because they are important to understand our museum. I have selected a few of the illustrations that the press was printing along these debates. So they started, the first one was actually 1985. It followed the screening of Claude Lanzmann film Shoah, great documentary film, and Poland was the only communist country to show it. The government officially protested that it is anti-Polish, but it allowed fragments on TV and the whole film in a few cinemas. So the special situation of Poland. And then in 1987 we had a quite large debate which was happening both in the legal press and in the underground press. And that was also important. Poland had quite substantial uncensored circulation of information thanks to the Solidarity movement. So these pictures tells you a lot. They tell you a lot about the difficult past. They tell you something about digging into earth, and this digging about human relics remaining in the mass graves. It tells you about the burden of the past. It tells you about a competition of victims. You can see in the center of the screen who is bigger victim. This a retroactive competition of victimhood, completely unproductive in any terms. And finally, one of my favorite ones on your right, that many people want to bear the pluses of history and only few the minus of history. So what are the assets and what are the liabilities of the past? But still some people are ready to take it up and show. And I think that was quite crucial. The biggest of those debates happened 20 years ago in the early 21st century, following the publication of a little book by Professor Jan Tomasz Gross, himself an exilee of 1968 Anti-Zionist Campaign. He spent most of his life in the United States. A little book, The Neighbors, about the mass killing of the Jews in the little town of Jedwabne, now in eastern Poland. Then it was the western end of the Soviet zone of occupation in summer of 1941. And that was not only the biggest debate on the Holocaust in Poland, it was the biggest debate on history in Poland ever. And we have hundreds and hundreds of press articles, plus thousands of interventions on radio, TV, major figures speaking, including the President of Poland, the ministers, Catholic bishops making special statements, artists, but also ordinary people, and of course, historians. And historians were important because they were bringing to these debates not only factual knowledge, not only expert knowledge, they were bringing certain culture of discussion, which is very different to what we see today online. And I will come back to this big shift from discussions that take place in the printed press to discussions that take place on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, because the rules of the game have changed and the effects of the game have changed. So it's not incidental that quite soon after this big debate about Jedwabne, these three partners the Association of the Jewish Cultural Institute, which is an NGO standing behind the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, the city of Warsaw, and the Ministry of Culture. That means you have city-level politicians and the national-level politicians, established a public-private partnership. Again, an innovative formula, legally innovative formula, to build the Museum of the History of Polish Jews. That was not the beginning. The idea of the museum was actually invented in 1993 at the opening of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., in America. Some of our colleagues were invited. They came back to Poland and said, we need to have such a museum, but not a Holocaust museum. And they meant a new model of the museum, the narrative museum, where the most important exhibit is a story. And all artifacts and pictures are to illustrate the story we present. So if you start counting in 1993, it took 21 years to open the core exhibition. It was a long process. Actually, it was a miracle, I must say, that it eventually happened, but quite a good miracle. An important role in this story played private donors. Private donors completely funded the production of the core exhibition and the cultural program, educational program that has been running. And here you can see their names on the wall of the museum. These were mostly Polish Jews in the United States, but not only. The single biggest donation was from a Polish Catholic, and also two governments, the government of Germany and the government of Norway that contributed. So that was really a collaborative effort. And I believe that the spirit of academic collaboration that was developed already in the 1980s with the relative opening of Polish academia, when Polish scholars of Jewish history could travel abroad, Israeli scholars, American scholars were coming to Poland, that we can talk in a way showing respect for our opponents, respecting the evidence, respecting the scholarship, and we can reach shared conclusions. So at the end of it, these were not Polish-Jewish discussions, because I agreed sometimes with my Israeli colleagues and we jointly disagreed with my Polish colleagues, or the other way around. So what started as Polish-Jewish debates were later on mostly Polish-Polish debates. These were internal debates in Poland with limited intervention from abroad. And I stress it because we have, at the bottom of it, we have a critical history which is developed in a transnational setting, where ethnic borders, national borders no longer matter. If you're a good historian, you're a good historian. Whatever you teach at the Tel Aviv University, Warsaw University, or an American university, it doesn't matter. Second, a culture of dialogue, which was also crucial for the Polish transformation. The peaceful revolution of 1989, which began with the negotiations between the Communist Party and the opposition, the idea that dialogue is better than fighting. And a certain idea of inclusive patriotism, that the Jews make part of Poland, that they are not aliens. That the Jewish history makes an integral part of the history of Poland, that you cannot understand history of Poland without the Jews. But also, you cannot understand the history of the Jews without Poland, at least the history of Jewish diaspora. Maybe the antiquity, yes, you can, but not the European history. So these three partners established, and you have this beautiful building, and I'm very happy. The building was designed by Rainer Malamaki, a great Finnish architect who has also designed the museum in Sztetl. He's really a fine architect. The building outside is relatively modest. It doesn't contrast with the entourage, this nondescript socialist architecture. The beauty is hidden in this main lobby. And I was surprised when we were opening the core exhibition in October 2014, so now it makes almost 7 years now, that it became a big political event. Here you can see the president of Poland speaking. Sitting is the president of Israel. We had most of the ministers of the Polish government sitting. You can see also Mr. Tusk, who was later had an important role in the European Union. You have the former President Kwaśniewski. That was a show of an agreement across the political divisions in Poland. And I must say that one of the founders of the museum, who signed the documents between the ministry, the city of Warsaw, and the association, was Lech Kaczyński, who was the mayor of Warsaw at the time. So that was not only the liberals and the left. No, that was going quite to the center-right, including the party of the Kaczynski brothers. As you know, President Kaczynski, they died in a plane crash. So big political profile event, and then quite massive media coverage. In 2 months, we had a collation of 4,000 articles from all around the world, articles and TV broadcastings in all kinds of languages, including, in Malaysia, places you would not expect to have interest in the opening of a Jewish museum in Warsaw. This led in turn to fast-growing number of visitors. Usually when you open a museum, it takes years to build the stream of visitors. Simply people don't know about you. Not everybody is a Louvre or National Gallery in Washington. You must build your reputation through years, be recognized to attract the visitors, and in our case, it happened like this. I think in the second year or the third year, we already had 400,000 visitors to the core exhibition. So that was quite massive. The numbers that you can see are up to the beginning of the pandemics, to the end of 2019, because then everything changed, of course. By the way, this is the major challenge for any museum anywhere now. What will happen after the pandemics? How soon will it be? So you can see there's really crowds of people. Sometimes it was crowded. People were queuing to get a ticket. Also, the development of educational programs. And I'm really grateful to my predecessors, people who were leading the museum before I came in 2014, that they developed the cultural program, educational program before the building was ready. First, people were recognizing the name of the museum, and they knew, oh, there are some interesting things going on, like cultural production by well-known artists. But they were also developing instruments of reaching a diverse public, including young people. So the museum has a fantastic educational program for beginning from the kindergarten to the doctoral students. So really all kinds of age groups, and we must assume that some people know very little. Actually, we were making research among our visitors. But it turned out that most of the people know almost nothing of Jewish history. Moreover, only a minority of them was coming to the museum because they had special interest in Jewish history. Some between 12 and 14% of the visitors to the core exhibition declared, when we asked why, they said, oh, I'm interested in Jewish history. Many more were coming because they had an interest in history in general. More than 30%, between 30 and 40% of the visitors had general interest, and they heard there is a new, good historical museum. It's about Jews, but I'm interested in history in general, I will go. And these were mostly Polish visitors. That means when I say Polish, Polish non-Jewish. Jewish community in Poland is very small. So these masses of Polish visitors were non-Jewish Poles who had an interest, and they were coming. But the third big group was much more interesting for me, academic historian. It was a group which was coming to the museum as a form of leisure. It was a way of spending time in an interesting and valuable way. So the museum was not competing with our museum. It was competing with a cinema or with the shopping mall. Where are you going to spend the afternoon on Saturday? That was the question. And I think it changed my way of thinking about cultural institutions. But still, in any case, it was a huge success, not only in terms of publicity and big numbers of people, but also about the opinions of experts. Because in relatively quick time, museum got a series of major museum awards, including the title of the European Museum of the Year. Not many museums have it. And second, the award of the European Museum Academy, which they don't give every year. They give it only when they believe there is something important happening in the museum field. So that was great. Actually, the staff was demoralized a little bit. They thought every few months we'll get an award. This cannot happen, of course. And of course, it reflected these many years of discussions and hard work of my predecessors, of the whole team, and especially people like Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, the chief curator of the core exhibition. Really deep thinking about every detail, about every word, about the color of the wall in the core exhibition. In addition to the core exhibition, which is the main part, as I said, a lot of education, classes, online, mobile exhibitions. But let me show you one more. The Daffodil Campaign. For the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, every April, the volunteers of the museum on a single day go into the streets of Warsaw and distribute yellow paper daffodils. By the way, designed by a young female artist. This yellow daffodils has a history. I'm not going to explain. Marek Edelman, a Grand Bundist, a fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto, he remained in Poland, was coming for the anniversary with yellow flowers. And this daffodil, it unfolds into the Star of David, which is a reference to what the Nazis imposed on Jews in many towns, yellow star. What was the sign of shame became the sign of memory. So, for example, in 2019, our volunteers distributed 250,000 of daffodils. You know, in a city of 2 million people, it's a lot. You can see it in the street how people walk. So this way, the memory of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and by consequence of the Warsaw Ghetto and of the Jewish history of Warsaw in general, was gradually coming back. It's a long-term process. But it showed that many people were ready to accept it. Okay? When you make research on the anti-Semitism in Poland, always some 20-something% when they ask, do you think that Jews have excessive influence on media politics? That means, you know, classic anti-Semitic statements, they say yes. And still randomly approaching people, our volunteers approaching people randomly, had very few refusals, which means also the anti-Semites were wearing the yellow Star of David. If this is not a miracle, I don't know what can be a miracle. So, great success, and I can say it and remain modest, because that was not my personal success. It was success of a team that had been working on it for many years. And the future was looking just bright. Every year we will have almost 500,000 visitors, we will work with education, things will look good. It didn't. Things change. And now comes another part of my lecture, which is how a success story can turn into a problematic story. We have changed the government and the president in 2015 into the party of Mr. Kaczynski, which, as I said, his brother, Lech Kaczynski, was a founder of the museum. Well, this party was not best known from fighting anti-Semitism, but it's not an anti-Semitic party either, although it won the election on a xenophobic ticket, anti-immigration ticket. You remember we had a refugee crisis at that time in Europe. But initially it looked good. The Ministry of Culture was providing the subsidy as promised, and I always stress it because money is important when you run an important institution. You know, you must pay the staff, you must pay for electricity bill at the end of it, so it was quite loyal. President Duda visited the museum. I guided him personally. At the end of the visit, standing in front of the cameras, he said, every young Pole should visit this museum. I couldn't expect anything better. But in early 2018, there was a coincidence of unfortunate factors. History is usually coincidental. The world changes because some things happen at one time. If they happened in different times, things would have looked different. And in our case, these were three things. It's difficult to show on a slide, especially for those who don't read Polish. In early 2018, the government introduced a bill which was to change the act on the Institute of National Remembrance, which is basically a big repository of the communist-era security archives. But not only. For example, in the Jedwabne debate, the IPN, this is the acronym for the Institute, played a very important role in providing solid research and a very solid publication on the killing in Jedwabne. So the government changed the law to punish anyone who would claim that the Polish nation or the Polish state was complicit in the Nazi crimes. And the main justification for the legislation was that some people in the world speak of Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps. Of course, there were no death camps or concentration camps in German-occupied Poland. There were German camps established in occupied Poland. However, fighting with such statements sometimes is fighting with the English grammar, because Polish camp means a camp in Poland, not necessarily a camp established by the Poles. Well, some people were expressing their prejudice that Poles had some kind of contribution to these camps, but mostly these were rather ignorant journalists using a shortcut. So that was the justification, but I don't think it was the real justification, because the effects were completely counterproductive. There was first, of course, the criticism in Poland, and I could not stay silent. I had to react as the director of the Jewish Museum in Warsaw. I had to say, this is a bad law, don't do it. Still before it was enacted by the Sejm, by Polish parliament. But then there was a very strong reaction in Israel. Israeli government reacted really strongly, we will not allow it, and there was a dramatic decline in Polish-Israeli relations that otherwise are very good. And then in Polish-American relations, because American Jewry mobilized also against this law. So we had really dramatic, one more discussion on the Holocaust in Poland, but not starting with an academic book or a thoughtful poem, as it was in 1987. The debate in 1987 started with extensive reading of the poem, by the way, written by Czesław Miłosz, who 1943 was in Warsaw watching the Warsaw Ghetto in flames and wrote 2 important poems on this topic. This time it was because of this legislation. And as I said, completely counterproductive. Millions of times online, the terms Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps were repeated in the following months. Eventually, after a few months, under international pressure, Polish government backed off. But the damage was done. The damage was done. And I said, I opposed it because any reasonable person knew what may happen if you enact such a legislation. You actually confirm the prejudice that Poles are hiding something really bad if you try to penalize statement. And second, the wording of this legislation was so muddy, unclear. What does it mean, the complicity of the Polish nation? That every Pole should have been involved in killing of the Jews, or only 5 of them is enough? And we have a lot of evidence that individual Poles were taking part in the killing. So bad legislation with bad effects, and which put the museum in opposition to the politicians of the ruling party. Second, 2018 was the 50th anniversary of 1968. And in 1968 in Poland, we had a student rebellion to which the communist government responded with police violence, but also with a propaganda campaign called Anti-Zionist Campaign. And I use the quotation mark anti-Zionist because it was the term Zionist was used like in the Soviet Union. It meant Jew. There was a joke in Polish. A boy comes back from school to his father and say, Dad, how do you write Zionist? You know, in Polish, how do you write Sionista? With a Z or with an S? And the dad said, I don't know, but before the war they wrote it with a J, with Z. So that was very clear. When we prepared the exhibition and our program, I would never thought that someone was ready to defend the communist anti-Semites. You know, in Poland, the communist regime had very few supporters after 1989. It was completely discredited in the 1980s. But then we went into a direct clash with some media people very close to the government. Why? Because at the end of this exhibition, and let me show just a fragment of it. This is Władysław Gomułka, the head of the Polish Communist Party, speaking in March 1968. And on the right, you have an original slogan, "We condemn the aggression of Israel," that people were wearing, you know, in the mass rallies to condemn the Zionists. That, you know, every Polish town had a mass meeting to condemn the Zionists. At the end of this exhibition, which was a very solid historical exhibition, what happened, why, Six-Day War in Israel, student rebellion in Poland, how the party decided to target the Zionists, that they claimed there was a Zionist conspiracy behind the youth rebellion. But what happened afterwards? The emigration of most of the remaining Polish Jews. But at the end of it, we gave one wall with contemporary quotations coming mostly from social media that were strikingly similar to the language of 1968. So similar that with my colleague, we both wrote books about 68, so we know it very well. We had a game. I was quoting a sentence and he was to guess, is it from 1968 or is it from 2018? It was really strikingly similar. The language was similar. So we put this quotation anonymously. It happened that 2 of them were coming from journalists very close to the government, who immediately started to attack us. And the third reason was 5 million euro. We've got a grant from the Norwegian government. I'm really grateful to the Norwegian government, who is generously supporting the museum. And the Minister of Culture tried to take half of the grant from us. You know, I can betray my holiest convictions, but I cannot give up 5 million euro. You don't do such things. So then the museum was under fire, and I was personally under fire. The minister tried to fire me. He couldn't, because of this legal complex structure of the museum. It requires the decision of the city of Warsaw, the association, and the minister to fire and to hire a director. He had to wait some time for the end of my term. Oh, here, some pictures from 1968. You can see Zionists to Israel. You can see Minister Dayan, and something which I like especially. We demanded the complete purge of the party from the Zionist filth, a combination of the Stalinist aggressive language and the anti-Semitic tradition of the Polish chauvinist right, which merged in 1968 into one. So a strange combination of red and brown forces. These attacks against the museum, well, that wasn't very pleasant, but had a positive effect. We have sold 120,000 tickets to the exhibition, which makes it the most popular exhibition on history in Poland ever. So thanks to the criticism coming from the media of the right and the ruling party, we suddenly had thousands of people who wanted to see what do they have so irritating. So that was an educational consequence which I welcome, and that was good. But otherwise, it wasn't good because this multi-partisan consensus that it's good for Poland to have a good museum of Jewish history has collapsed. We had, for example, deputies from the ruling party in the Senate asking questions. How you make, for example, Professor Michał Bilewicz, a social psychologist, the best expert on anti-Semitism in Poland today, had a lecture at our museum, and they attacked him. How you can speak about anti-Semitism in Poland today? Well, there is, so you can speak. So methods which no academic can accept were, and as I said, strikingly similar to the mood of 1968 were coming. This culture of dialogue, which means when you disagree with someone, first you try to understand him or her and provide some arguments that he or she is wrong, specific arguments, rather than insult him or call him a traitor or call him a foreign agent. And this cooperative spirit, without which you cannot make anything big. If you want to make a big, great museum, you must cooperate with people of different ideas and agree, okay, these are the topics that we disagree, but there are some topics that we agree on. And that was shaken. And I told you that I will come back to the media of discussion, because for me it's not coincidence that these great Polish debates on the past mostly happened before 2010. And they were productive. They were bringing a better understanding of the past, a really sincere soul searching from a Christian perspective or from a humanist perspective on the history of Poland. Because they were happening in the printed press, in the daily newspapers, weekly newspapers, or television. After 2010, public debate moved to social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. We changed completely the rules of the game. And now we know that if you want to have massive follow-up on Twitter, you must write controversial things. The same on Facebook. If you want to attract people, you must write something emotional and use strong words. And then you win. If you are moderate, if you try to understand your opponent, if you are looking for a compromise or for an understanding of the past that would be truthful and acceptable to more people than you lose. And I think this is the single most important factor which is behind the degeneration of the Polish debates on history, not only about Polish Jewish history. We see the same about debates on the history of the Solidarity movement, of the communist period, a general crisis. and the rise of the populist approach to politics. But there is one more factor, which I understood thanks to a book of two American political scientists. One of them is an immigrant from Poland, Jan Kubrick, and Michael Barnard. They wrote a book about the year 2009. In 2009, practically everywhere in Central Europe, there were official commemorations of the 1989 end of the communist regimes. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, the Czech and Slovak republics now, and so on. So they had comparative material, and they wrote a very solid book about it. And they identified that there are three types of politicians who take part in these commemorations. Basically, three types. One type is, I would say, pluralistic. Okay, you have this opinion about 1989, I have another opinion, we must live together, let's celebrate the ideas that we share. It was a great peaceful revolution, except for a really small number of people who were killed. It was relatively peaceful in most of Eastern Europe. For a communist regime that lasted for so many decades and the Soviet army standing behind it, it was really a miracle. So let's celebrate it, especially in Poland, where it started. Second was abnegationist. People who, especially from the post-communist circles, who prefer not to talk about it. They didn't have anything to be much proud of. They preferred not to talk about it, in many countries, Bulgaria, for example. But there was a third group, and for me that was opening my mind, which Kubrick and Barnard called mnemonic warriors. People who love to fight about memory. And they pointed at two politicians, Mr. Orban in Hungary and Mr. Kaczynski in Poland, who have a completely different political strategy, who deliberately destroy consensus about the past, start conflict, unleash emotions, and then use these emotions to win. And when I realized it 10 years later, reading the book, I realized, oh my God, they won. Out of the many politicians who were running governments in Central and Eastern Europe at the time, there were the two remaining guys. One was for a long time, one was shorter. But I realized this is an effective strategy. So there are political entrepreneurs who have a particular strategy of talking about the past, which is not conducive to consensus and to cooperation. It's to incite emotion, mobilize with these strong emotions your electoral base, demobilize your opponents, but you cannot make a museum with this. You can undermine it, but you cannot build. So that was my rather pessimistic conclusion out of it. And especially when you make a big cultural institution, the investment process takes years. It takes a lot of money. You cannot change museums with every change of the government. You can change the content of a newspaper, you can change your website, but not a museum. And in Poland we have seen not only the attacks against Polin Museum, which were moderate, comparing to the attacks that went against the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk. A group of historians established a really great plan, a really thoughtful plan to make a museum of the Second World War, which is not parochial, which tells the story of the global conflict, but from a Central European perspective, from the perspective of the city of Gdańsk, where the war started on September 1st, 1939. And they were attacked by the government heavily. The director was fired, they lost their jobs, they were defending the core exhibition, and a political appointee was appointed the director, completely loyal to the ruling party. Another story was the story of the Museum of the Solidarity Movement, the European Solidarity Center in Gdańsk. Again, a great museum, a narrative exhibition showing one of the most glorious pages of Polish history. The Solidarity Movement is a really glorious page. And it was under heavy fire, heavy attacks coming from the government. The government could not fire the director because there is a public-private partnership with the city of Gdańsk and the local government and Lech Wałęsa and his foundation. So we have several examples of the takeover of cultural institutions. Well, it's relatively easy to take over an institution. It's much more difficult to build one and make it last. So I'm afraid that this dynamics of the memory politics doesn't work with long-term thinking about the past, doesn't bring peace between the nations, doesn't bring a better understanding of your past. It brings a distorted understanding. I don't say completely false, but distorted. You overemphasize some topics, such as the rescue by Christian Poles of the Jews, for example, and you underemphasize which are the dark pages, which is participation in killing, for example. Both things happened, but this is a matter of proportions, how you show it. I don't want to be pessimistic when completing my lecture. I am about to complete it, and I will be very happy to answer your questions. I believe that in the long term, the basis of the project of the Polin Museum, which is first, being trustworthy, speaking the truth so that people can trust you, is solid. While the visions of the past that are deliberately distorted to please the public, or make it angry, or make it loyal to a political leader, because they are based on lies at the bottom of them, they cannot stand. And maybe I am excessively optimist, because my formative experience was Poland of the 1980s. I saw the end of the communist dictatorship and the end of the Soviet Union, which was also based on lies. And I believe you cannot build on lies, but you can build on truth. So even if we face such problems in many countries, not only in Poland, we have aggressive politicians who promise to make your country great again and offer a vision of the past which probably never happened, but which is divisive. I think this is short-sighted, and still the power of the truth is elsewhere. Thank you very much. The Institute of National Remembrance, IPN, as we call it in Poland, was established in late 1990s, not immediately, with quite a delay, with the mission basically to deal with the archives of the Communist Security Service. And this way it followed the German model of the Gauck Institute. But then it expanded. The major part are the archives, but then it had the research, education department, and then various governments started adding new functions, such as taking care of the war cemeteries and crimes of the Nazi period and the communist period. So it was growing. For me now it looks very much like the combinat of the communist era, you know, a big enterprise having everything under one head. It was to deal mostly with the problem of the communist secret agents, which was a real problem because the people were alive. And there was a question what to do about it. But as I said, its first major task was to respond to the Jedwabne debate. And it responded excellently. They established a group of really serious historians. Historians investigated the document, published 2 solid volumes on the topic. And not much changed since that moment in terms of our knowledge. But already at that time, I realized that this is such a big institution. For example, the budget of IPN is bigger than the combined budgets of all academic research institutions in Poland. That it became the biggest publisher of books in history. It publishes more books in history than all other publishers. So in economic terms, if you produce sugar or bicycles and you have one company dominating the market, it's never good. And I realized that when you have such a powerful institutions shaping the public narratives of the past, people who desire power will try to take it over. And this happened. It happened twice under the first government of the Law and Justice, Mr. Kaczynski party. And then the parliament amended the law to protect the institute from political interference. Namely, the president of the institute was elected in a very complex way. First, academic centers were to propose members of the board of the council of the museum, and then the parliament out of this group could elect the members of the councils, like a supervisory body, which then elected the president. So it was a way to protect the institute from politicians, basically. Very wise. Which was when under the populist party now, it was dismantled very quickly. And now there is no protection, there is a full political control, and IPN became a mouthpiece of propaganda, basically. There are still some good historians hiding in the small offices, this is where they have a job. This is the biggest employer for historians of the 20th century in Poland, of course. You must think about a whole generation of young historians got a job, which they couldn't get at the universities. And in the last years, it completely lost authority in academic circles. Now, for example, my foreign colleagues, they ask me, well, there is this book published by a historian from IPN. Should I read it at all? And I say, well, some books are good, but the general policy is bad. So the Institute, its annual budget is now more than 400 million zloty. It's more than 100 million euro annually. It's a huge institution, but its academic and moral authority dramatically declined because of this political manipulation. That's a pity, because this is a waste of money now. If you cannot make good research and it's not even good for propaganda purposes, so why to waste the money?
My question deals with the future of the Polin Museum. Hopefully you were able to protect that 5 million euros from Norway. And has the budget of the museum been reduced in any way? And also, since you're not a government agency, you still can tell the truth through your exhibits. I think they can't censor your exhibits in any way except by cutting funding or others, but then you can raise private funds for exhibitions and so forth. So maybe there's a way to survive this period and this current government and still tell the truth.
Excellent question. Money is important. It doesn't make you happy, but it's necessary to do things. Polin Museum is unique in Poland. It is unique in Poland among the museums because almost all the museums, great majority of the museums in Poland are public. They belong mostly to the local governments, like city museums, regional museums, or to the Ministry of Culture, National Museum. Some of them belong to the army, but these are small numbers, which means most of the funding comes from public sources. And they are quite sensitive, especially to politics at local level. Local politicians can be as intrusive as national politicians, and sometimes even more. And I can give you an excellent example. The Silesian Museum in Katowice, fantastic modern museum built in a former coal mine, is director Alicja Knast, excellent manager. Silesian herself, this region at the Polish-Czech border. Fantastic manager. She lost her job because of tensions with local politicians of the ruling party. And now she is the director of the National Gallery in Prague, in Czech Republic. She won the competition. So Poland lost a very good museum manager, and Czech Republic won the very good museum manager. There are even similar conflicts at the very smallest level. My favorite example is the Fairy Tale Museum in a small town of Pacanov, some 2,000 inhabitants. Really tiny, tiny. And again, so you have politics at various levels, which means the only way to protect this museum is to protect the autonomy of culture, the principle that culture is too important to be under control and be part of the political fighting like other issues are. And there are some things that are so important. Culture is one, money is another. This is why national banks are so, or should be, independent, not to print money as the government wanted. So there are some public goods that should be protected. The autonomy of academia, of research. Again, we have academic institutions, we have a strong European tradition that the government does not interfere into universities. Academics have the elected bodies, synods, councils, they do it by themselves. Of course, the government can cut money, give money, less, but there is a respect for the autonomy. And this is one thing. Respect the autonomy. Because if you don't respect the autonomy of cultural institutions, a museum is a cultural institution, which means you reduce freedom. Art without freedom is suffocating, sooner or later. So it's only the delusion of political control It's becoming simply bad art sooner or later, or bad history sooner or later. So Polin was unique because we managed to have 4 financial legs. One was the subsidy from the Ministry of Culture, from the city of Warsaw was the second, about 25% each, from tickets, and from grants and private donations. But as I said, we were unique because we had Jewish donors. This great Jewish tradition of charity, of making foundation, subsidizing communal institutions. Most of our private donations were coming from abroad, mostly from Polish Jews in the United States. So this is rather a unique situation. You don't have other museums that have such a strong source of private money coming. And this is in many European countries. This is not unique to Poland. I must say that the government did not cut funding. They didn't give us more. In some years they were giving us extra money for some purposes. So they stopped giving us extra money, but they kept giving basic subsidy. However, in case of the Solidarity Museum in Gdańsk, this is exactly what happened. First, the minister demanded to change the director. The director was re-elected, Basil Karski, excellent director of a very good museum, with the support of the city. He was re-elected. Then the minister demanded to have a deputy director of his choice, which means breaking the institution into 2 parts. You know, old Bolshevik tactics. You put a person inside to break the institution down. When this failed, the minister cut the subsidy and established a parallel institution with the same mission. So you have 2 competing institutions, but one is non-existent. One was invented only to compete. By the way, the minister established in Warsaw the Museum of the Warsaw Ghetto. So there are 2 Jewish museums in Warsaw now. One exists, another is working, reportedly, but nobody knows why. There is a reason, to make them compete. Divide et impera, the old imperial tradition. So in our case, the ministry kept paying the money, and because of this diversity and grants like the Norwegian grant, we could manage. But then came the epidemic, which means you sell no tickets. And tickets made 25% of the revenue, and you still have 160 people staff. It's a big institution. So this is the major challenge facing most of cultural institutions, and not only in Europe. I have read that in the United States, probably some 25% of the museums will not reopen. In America, most of the museums are private. So they are heavily dependent on selling tickets and so on. So now this is the major challenge, and we will see how European societies will move out of epidemics. Will the public come back, or they will prefer to watch the museums online? I hope the public will come back, because this is the unique experience of being with other people, and especially in authentic places, seeing authentic objects. So I hope it will come back, but it has shown quite dramatically also the need for financial independence. One is the legal autonomy, which works as long as you have the rule of law. As long as the government, local government, central government respects the rule of law, they follow the law, it's okay. But there are governments that don't follow the law, including mine. And second is financial independence. And the only way for financial independence is diversifying the sources of revenue. It's like any risky situation. When you run a business, you diversify your sources, not to put all the eggs in one basket. But in continental Europe, this is difficult, because historically, let's say, these were public institutions, so they rely. It will remain a challenge for many cultural institutions how to handle it. There are better ways and worse ways of doing it, but for the time being, we have the pandemics, and it's difficult to prophesize how a future might look like in 2 years from now, for example.
You talked a little bit about the change in the political discussion, and you, in a sense, not blame, but described the role of social media. And it certainly seems to have affected political polarization in many, many parts of the world, not just Eastern Europe. how do you see that unfolding? I mean, I don't see social media going away, and and I don't see politicians who want to take advantage of that going away, not to mention bots and all of these other things that take place in social media. Do you see any possibilities for a future of civil discussion again on these controversial issues?
Well, of course I do. It depends on algorithms. Algorithms are written by coders, by IT people, and IT people get guidelines from the managers. I would say it's not difficult to change the algorithm. It will take maybe a few weeks, maybe a few months to change it. And I would love, for example, Facebook to make a small project in a relatively small European language, like Polish or Lithuanian. Change the algorithm only for this language and see what happens. You can make experiments. And now there is quite a lot of literature about what kind of content you see and what you don't see, which means what algorithm is showing you and what is not showing you. And this is controversial, emotional, divisive, because it keeps you watching. And then the medium can sell advertisement and make $5 billion quarterly profit. So when you have democracy on one hand and $5 billion on the other, the choice is quite difficult, I understand. But it reminds me an old joke from Warsaw in the 1930s, a kiosk with newspapers standing on the corner, and a Jew running the kiosk with newspapers. And his friend comes and see there is a newspaper of the fascist party of ONR, National Radicals. He said, Moshe, how you can sell this anti-Semitic garbage here? Well, when I make 10 groszy on a copy, it's not fully anti-Semitic. Of course it remains anti-Semitic, even when you make money out of it. So it's technically possible. There are ways to make it and test it, but it will take a will. And let me make a historical comparison. In the late 19th century, we also had a revolution in communication, which resulted, today's revolution comes from the internet and the smartphone, this combination. The revolution in the late 19th century resulted from the new technology of making paper and print much cheaper than before. Before 1870s, paper was expensive. Then it became cheap. And a social change, which was a new generation of literate people, people who were educated in elementary schools across Europe for the first time in history. Practically at least every male young man could read something. So this combination led to a new medium, cheap newspapers, the yellow press, which were scandalous and mostly chauvinist. And you cannot understand the spread of modern anti-Semitism without this media. This pseudo-scientific, allegedly based on the science of race, anti-Semitism that was, or conspiracy theories, like the Illness of Zion that was spreading in Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century, was spreading with this new media. What was the cost? For example, you cannot understand the beginning of the First World War, the summer of 1914, without these newspapers. They were pushing politicians to the wall. You must show how patriotic you are, how good French you are facing the Germans, how good Russian you are facing the Germans, and so on. That was quite a dramatic cost. But then ways of dealing with it were invented. And I don't mean censorship. I don't mean censorship. Simply there emerged reliable newspapers and education and so on. But it costed a lot. World War was a costly event. Will it happen again? I don't know. But I know it's possible to avoid. We already have substantial cost of this polarization. And you see, in America, the degree of polarization is really dramatic. So I hope we can make it, but I don't know if we will. Thank you very much for your attention, your questions. Thank you.
I would like to ask Professor Stola, based on the story which you told, your personal story, and not only your personal story about the situation and political pressure and manipulations and distortions, you mentioned that Orban and Kaczynski won. I have a different impression. As long as people like yourself, academics, are, despite their public and institutional position, you acted as independent scholar, a person who didn't give up, okay? And I believe that by that you protected the very foundations of democratic debate and democratic institutions, despite the fact that you were forced to leave the position. But it took them a long time to do what they've done. You were running a very, very successful institution from every point of view. I would like just to the audience and then the audience which would listen to the lecture, try to think of the numbers. It's not only in the Jewish museum world, the numbers which were presented of the visitors to Polin Museum between 2014 and 2019 are considered a success. In the whole museum industry, these numbers are incredible for the museum, which picks up on the topic, which is very specific. It is, so to say, speaking of the certain group or history of certain group of people, called the culture and history, but you know, the majority of the visitors are non-Jewish, as you mentioned. And these numbers were absolutely incredible. So you mentioned other cases in Poland, but I think that sort of don't you think that this sort of this kind of defending the public interest by keeping that position, by defending the academic freedom, don't you think that this is important in this battle of the memories?
Of course, this is crucial, and I said, because at the bottom of it is good historiography. I believe that the means and instruments developed in the European academia in the past centuries are the best ways of learning the truth about the past. The problem is that the expert knowledge is challenged globally. You know, about vaccines, about climate change, there are plenty of things. There are people who are ignorant and they claim I know better. So the history is just a case. The problem with historical knowledge is that certain claims about the past, this memory politics, is not only bad in itself, but they are used to justify other politics. For example, in international relations, and they don't lead to peace. This is no way of bringing peace and understanding between them. This is the opposite. This is a way of approaching an increasingly aggressive conflict. So what I was doing, and what, for example, the colleagues at the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk were doing, they were defending the museum. They had a protracted legal battle before the minister fired them. They were fighting in courts and still producing the core exhibition. You know, they were like repairing a boat and sailing it, or great challenge, which gave me a year more because the government was busy with the other museum. They were buying times for others, and I think I was buying time for someone else. I don't know, maybe for the director of the Auschwitz Museum, who was also under fire for a moment, and then things got more quiet. So I think time is important. As long as you can resist, you do resist. And the question of this symbiosis of academia and culture, and of museum and historiography, is a precondition. Because if we don't believe, we say the best knowledge about the past, then we are much more open to the pressure, to interests. If we remove the truth with a big T from the equation, suddenly powers influence, national interest, whatever it is, becomes more powerful. But in the long term, the distortions will come up. You cannot conceal them forever. Some people claim, oh, well, let's don't talk about these difficult pages in our past because our enemies will use it. propaganda of Mr. Putin will use it to defame Poland. It's the opposite. If you don't speak about it, they will see this is your weakness, and then they will use it. So concealing difficult past is not a solution. It's just a way of delaying the problem for the next generation, which will be to the moment, which will be much more difficult than we have. So what you have said, this is kind of a crucial junction between the idea of the truth, between the academia, cultural institutions, historiography, and museums. And thank you very much for the invitation again.
Thank you very much, Professor Stola. Thank you for coming. We hope to see you again in coming spring. Given the situation, we believe that we will continue the series of lectures in cooperation with Vilnius University, and we will be inviting you and others to come and to listen for the lectures, to debate, to discuss, ask questions. The more we speak about these problems, the more hope we have that these problems will be resolved sooner rather than later. So thanks again for coming. Have a great evening and very good weekend. Goodbye.